There was a man who lived to be 111 years old. He survived World War I, survived the trenches, survived the Battle of Passchendaele, one of the bloodiest battles in human history. He lived through 9 decades of peace, saw the entire 20th century. I watched the world change beyond recognition, and for 90 years, he refused to talk about the war. His name was Harry Patch, the last surviving British soldier who fought in the trenches of World War I, the last man who could tell us what it was really like. When he finally spoke at age 100, he told a story so haunting, so devastating, that it explained why he'd stayed silent for nearly a century. It was about his best friend, a shell crater, and a poison gas that killed you 24 hours after you thought you'd survived. This is the story Harry Patch carried with him for 90 years. The memory that was so painful, he couldn't speak it out loud until he was older than most people ever live. And today, I'm going to share it with you. Before we get to that day in 1917, you need to understand who Harry Patch was. Born June 17, 1898, in Combe Down, Somerset, England. A small village, rolling hills, quiet. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Harry was a plumber's apprentice, learning the trade from his father. He was good with his hands, practical, level-headed, just a normal British teenager, living a normal life. And then, the Great War came. Harry was conscripted in 1916. He was 18 years old. He didn't volunteer like so many young men did in 1914. By 1916, the romance of war was dead. Everyone knew what the trenches were like. Everyone knew boys were dying by the thousands. But conscription didn't care. Britain needed soldiers. Harry Patch became one of them. He was assigned to the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry, trained as a Lewis gunner. That's a light machine gun, a crucial weapon in trench warfare. In June 1917, Harry was shipped to Belgium, to a place called the Ypres salient, and specifically to Passchendaele. If you know anything about World War I, that name should make you pause. Passchendaele. It's synonymous with horror, with mud, with death. The Third Battle of Ypres, commonly called Passchendaele, lasted from July to November 1917. Over 500,000 casualties. Some historians say closer to 900,000 when you count both sides. The battlefield was a swamp. Constant rain had turned the ground into liquid mud. Men and horses drowned in shell craters. The wounded would sink into the mud and disappear. This was hell, and 19-year-old Harry Patch was right in the middle of it. But Harry had something that kept him going. His crew, his friends. There were 4 of them on the Lewis gun team. Harry was the gunner. There was Tommy, who fed the ammunition, and 2 other mates whose names Harry would later recall with perfect clarity. But one name, one man, stood out above all others. His best friend, a boy about his age. They'd trained together, fought together, kept each other alive through weeks of shelling and attacks. Harry never publicly revealed his friend's full name, even decades later. Some privacy, some grief, is too sacred to share with the world. He only ever called him his mate or his friend, the oi who would haunt him for 90 years. September 22nd, 1917. Harry's unit was holding a section of the line near Pilcombe Ridge. It had been a relatively quiet day. Quiet in Passchendaele terms meant only intermittent shelling instead of constant bombardment. Harry and his friend were in a shell crater. That's where you lived in Passchendaele. The official trenches had been obliterated by artillery, so soldiers sheltered in water-filled craters, connected by shallow ditches. It was late afternoon. They were exhausted, cold, wet, but alive. Harry later recalled they were talking about home, about Somerset, about what they'd do when the war ended, if the war ended. Then the shelling started. German artillery. Nothing unusual at first. High explosive shells, the earth shaking, the deafening boom of explosions. But then the shells changed. Different sound, softer, almost a plop instead of an explosion. And then nothing. No blast, no shrapnel. Gas shells. Harry recognized them immediately. Every soldier knew that sound by September 1917. Gas warfare had been going on for over 2 years. Masks, Harry shouted. Both of them scrambled for their small box respirators. Those rubberized face masks with the filter canister. By 1917, every British soldier carried one. Your gas mask was more important than your rifle. Harry got his mask on, secured the straps, made sure the seal was tight, checked his friend. His friend's mask was on too, but there was a problem. The rubber facepiece had a tear, small, just a small split along the edge where the rubber had degraded, probably from the constant mud and moisture. His friend was breathing through a compromised mask. They were in a shell crater, and here's the thing about phosgene. It's heavier than air. It sinks. It settles into low ground, into craters, into dugouts. That crater, their shelter, became a gas trap. Harry tried to share his mask. He tried to get his friend to climb out of the crater, to get to higher ground. But the shelling was still ongoing. Climbing out meant certain death from high explosive shells. So they waited. For what felt like hours, but was probably 30 minutes. Huddled in that crater, Harry breathing through his mask, his friend breathing through that torn, inadequate seal. Finally, the shelling stopped. The gas began to disperse. After checking with a candle, an old trick, if the flame burned steady, the air was mostly clear, they removed their masks. Harry's friend coughed a little, rubbed his eyes, but he seemed okay. "I'm all right, Harry," he said. "Just a bit of a tickle in my throat." He even joked about it, made some comment about the German gas not being as bad as everyone said. They both thought he'd survived. They were wrong. Phosgene is a chemical weapon with delayed effects. Let me explain what was happening inside his friend's body. Even as they sat there, relieved, thinking the danger had passed. Phosgene, chemical formula COCl2, doesn't cause immediate pain. When you breathe it in, it travels deep into your lungs, into the alveoli, those tiny air sacs where oxygen enters your blood. There, phosgene reacts with moisture. It breaks down into hydrochloric acid. That acid damages the delicate tissue of the alveoli. Your body, trying to heal the damage, sends fluid to the injured tissue. Lots of fluid. This process takes time, usually 12 to 48 hours. Harry's friend had been exposed for maybe 20 or 30 minutes through that torn mask. Not a huge amount, but enough. And the worst part? He felt fine. At first. That evening, they were relieved by another unit and moved back to a slightly safer position. Still within artillery range, but not front line. Harry's friend was coughing occasionally. Nothing serious, just a dry cough. Everyone had some kind of cough. The dampness, the mud, the smoke. It was impossible not to have a cough in Passchendaele. They ate their rations, bully beef and stale biscuits. Harry remembered this detail decades later, how his friend complained the food tasted funny, that the gas had affected his sense of taste. They talked about how lucky they'd been, how they'd survived another day. Around midnight, they tried to sleep, curled up in whatever dry spot they could find. The coughing had gotten worse, wetter, but still nothing alarming. At some point in the early morning hours, Harry wasn't sure exactly when. His friend woke him up. "Harry," he said, "something's wrong. I can't breathe right." When Harry Patch finally told this story at age 100, his voice would crack. Even after 90 years, even after living an entire lifetime, this part broke him. His friend was drowning. By dawn, the coughing had become constant. Deep, wet, rattling coughs. And he was bringing up fluid. Pink fluid. Frothy. A mixture of blood and plasma. His lungs were filling with edema. The fluid accumulating faster than his body could absorb it. Harry called for the medics. They came, looked at him, and there was nothing they could do. This was 1917. No antibiotics, no mechanical ventilation, no intensive care. Once pulmonary edema from phosgene set in, medicine was helpless. The medic told Harry what was going to happen. Told him his friend would probably die within 24 hours, maybe sooner. There was no point moving him to a field hospital. He wouldn't survive the journey, so Harry stayed with him. For the next 18 hours, Harry Patch held his best friend's hand while he drowned on dry land. Let me tell you what that looks like, what Harry witnessed. Pause, clinical but empathetic. His friend struggled to breathe. Every breath was a fight. The fluid in his lungs meant less and less space for air. His lips turned blue. Cyanosis, lack of oxygen. He kept coughing up that pink foam, more and more of it. It would bubble out of his mouth and nose. The sound. Harry described the sound as the worst part. A wet, rattling, gurgling sound. Like trying to breathe through water, because that's exactly what it was. His friend knew he was dying. He was fully conscious through most of it, aware, terrified. He asked Harry to write to his mother. Tell her he couldn't finish the sentence. Coughing fit. He tried to apologize for his mask being damaged, for not checking it properly, as if it was his fault. Harry told him to shut up, to save his breath, told him he'd be fine. Lies that both of them knew were lies. Around 6 p.m. on September 23rd, about 24 hours after the gas attack, his friend died. Harry was holding his hand when it happened. One moment, labored breathing. Then, nothing. Just silence. Harry said later that he stayed there for another hour. Just sitting with the body, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. Eventually, a corporal came and told him to move on. There were other wounded who needed attention. His friend's body would be buried later. Harry never found out where. There was no grave marker, no way to visit. The mud of Passchendaele swallowed bodies by the thousands. His best friend just disappeared into the Flanders mud. Harry Patch survived the war. Barely. 3 weeks after his friend died, on September 22nd, 1917, exactly 3 weeks to the day from the gas attack, Harry was hit by shrapnel during an artillery barrage. The wound was serious, metal fragments in his groin and leg. He was evacuated to England. Spent months in hospital recovering. He never returned to the front. The war ended in November 1918 while he was still recovering. Harry went home to Somerset, returned to his plumbing trade, got married, had children, lived what appeared to be a normal, quiet life. But he never talked about the war. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. For 80 years, Harry Patch maintained complete silence about his war experiences. His family knew he'd served. They knew he'd been wounded. but he refused to discuss it. If someone asked, he'd change the subject. If someone pushed, he'd leave the room. He wouldn't watch war films. He wouldn't attend Remembrance Day ceremonies. He avoided anything that might trigger the memories. Imagine that, carrying that weight for 80 years. The memory of holding your best friend's hand while he drowned in his own fluids. The sound of that rattling breath. The helplessness. And never speaking it, never sharing that burden, just carrying it alone. Harry once said, in an interview when he was 108, that he'd had nightmares about that day almost every week of his life. For 90 years, the same dream, the crater, the gas, his friend's face, the pink foam, the breathing that got slower and slower and slower until it stopped. Week after week, year after year, decade after decade. That's what war did to Harry Patch. Something changed when Harry turned 100. By the year 1998, Harry was one of only a handful of surviving British World War I veterans. The men who'd actually fought in the trenches were dying. Soon, there would be no one left to tell the story. Historians and journalists began seeking out the last veterans, trying to record their testimonies before it was too late. At first, Harry refused. Same as always. He didn't want to talk about it. He'd maintained his silence for 8 decades. Why break it now? But his family encouraged him, gently. They told him his story mattered, that future generations needed to hear from someone who'd actually been there. And maybe Harry was tired of carrying it alone. In 1998, at age 100, Harry Patch gave his first interview about the war. He was hesitant, emotional, but he talked. And once he started, it seemed like a dam had broken. Over the next 11 years, Harry became one of the most important witnesses to World War I. He gave hundreds of interviews, wrote an autobiography titled The Last Fighting Tommy, met with German veterans for reconciliation ceremonies. He became an advocate for peace, an outspoken critic of war. He famously said, quote voice, like reciting something meaningful, "War is organized murder and nothing else." And when he talked about his friend, the boy who died in his arms at Passchendaele, he would cry. At 105 years old on television, Harry Patch cried telling that story. The grief was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. 90 years later, and the wound hadn't healed. Interviewers would ask him, "What haunts you most about the war?" And Harry would always give the same answer. Not the shelling, not his own wounds, not the mud or the cold or the fear, the sound of his friend drowning, the wet, rattling breathing, the helplessness of watching someone die and being unable to do anything, the guilt of surviving when his friend didn't. That sound, that haunted him until his own final breath. By 2008, Harry Patch had become famous, not because he sought fame, but because he was a living connection to history. He was the last British soldier who'd fought in the trenches of World War I. The media called him the last fighting Tommy, Tommy being the British slang for a common soldier. At 110 years old, Harry met a German veteran named Charles Kuntz. Kuntz had fought on the opposite side at Passchendaele. They embraced. 2 old men, former enemies, both haunted by the same war. They became friends, spoke about reconciliation, about how the young men in the trenches on both sides were just pawns, how they'd had more in common with each other than with the generals who sent them to die. Harry visited schools, talked to young people. His message was always the same. War is pointless. War is waste. Don't let it happen again. He returned to Belgium in 2007. First time since 1917. 90 years later. He visited Passchendaele, saw the war cemeteries, thousands of graves, hundreds of thousands of names on memorials to the missing. He looked for his friend's name, never found it. His friend might be in one of those graves, might be one of those names, or might be one of the countless bodies never identified. Just gone. Harry said that visit broke something in him. All those dead boys, all those wasted lives. And for what? The war to end all wars. 20 years later, they did it again. Bigger. Worse. All that death, all that suffering. And humanity learned nothing. Harry Patch died on July 25, 2009. He was 111 years old, the oldest man in Europe at the time. He outlived every single person he'd served with, outlived his wife, outlived most of his children. When he died, Britain gave him a funeral befitting his status. Not as a war hero. Harry would have hated that label. But as the last witness, the last man who could say, "I was there." His coffin was draped in the Union Jack. Soldiers from the light infantry carried him. Thousands lined the streets of Wells, Somerset, to pay respects. Representatives from Belgium, France, and Germany attended. The German ambassador laid a wreath, a powerful symbol. Former enemies united in honoring a man who'd spent his last years advocating for peace. The Archbishop of Canterbury gave the eulogy. He spoke about Harry's courage, not the courage to fight, but the courage to speak, the courage to break 80 years of silence, the courage to share his pain so that future generations might understand. At the end of the service, a bugler played the last post, that mournful, haunting melody, the traditional farewell to fallen soldiers. And with Harry's death, a direct human link to World War I was severed. There were no more British combat veterans left. No more living voices who could say, "This is what the trenches were really like." Harry was the last, but his story remains. So why does Harry Patch's story matter? Why am I telling you about one soldier and one death among millions? Because Harry's story is about more than World War I. It's about the true cost of war. We see the statistics. 20 million dead in World War I. Numbers on a page. But we don't see the individuals. We don't see the 19-year-old boy drowning in a shell crater. We don't see his best friend holding his hand, helpless. And we don't see the aftermath. The 90 years of nightmares, the silence, the grief that never heals. Harry Patch carried his trauma for his entire life. He was 19 when his friend died. He was 111 when he finally died himself. That's 92 years of carrying that weight. Think about that. Nearly a century of waking up to those memories. Nearly a century of hearing that rattling breath in his dreams. War doesn't end when the shooting stops. War follows you home. War lives in your head. War steals decades from you, even if you survive. Harry's message in his final years was clear. War is not glorious. War is not noble. War is not an adventure. War is young men dying in muddy craters while their friends watch helplessly. War is chemicals that make you drown on dry land. War is trauma that lasts a lifetime. He wanted us to understand that, to really understand it, not as abstract history, but as human reality. And here's what struck me most about Harry's story. He didn't hate the Germans, even after everything he experienced, even after his best friend was killed by German gas shells. He understood that the German soldiers were just like him, boys who'd been conscripted, boys who didn't want to be there, boys who were just trying to survive. The enemy wasn't the German soldiers. The enemy was war itself. When Harry met that German veteran, Charles Quentz, at age 110, they didn't see each other as enemies. They saw each other as fellow survivors. Two old men who'd both been scarred by the same senseless conflict. That's powerful. That's the lesson Harry wanted us to learn. The soldiers on both sides, they have more in common with each other than with the people who send them to war. Harry's friend died from phosgene gas, one of the 85,000 men killed by that particular chemical weapon in World War I. Phosgene was the silent killer, the gas that let you think you'd survived, and then killed you anyway, 24 hours later. Harry's friend felt fine after the attack. He joked about it. He ate dinner. He thought he was lucky. He had no idea his lungs were already filling with fluid. No idea that by the time symptoms appeared, it would be too late. That's what made phosgene so cruel, the false hope. And that's what haunted Harry, the fact that for several hours, they both thought his friend had survived. They made plans, talked about what they'd do after the war, all while his friend was already dying. Chemical weapons were supposed to be banned after World War I. The 1925 Geneva Protocol prohibited their use, but they never really went away. Nations kept stockpiles. Research continued. New, more lethal chemicals were developed. Phosgene was used in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. It's been used in Syria in the 2010s. The ghost of Harry's friend's death still haunts modern battlefields. Harry lived long enough to see that humanity hadn't learned, that we're still using poison gas to kill each other. That knowledge, I think that hurt him as much as the original trauma. All that suffering, all those deaths, his friend's death, and we're still doing it. Harry Patch lived for 111 years. He survived the worst battle of the worst war in history. He carried trauma for 9 decades. And in the end, he used his final years to beg us not to repeat the mistakes of his generation. His friend's name is lost to history. We don't know where he's buried. There's no grave to visit. He's just one of millions who died in the mud of Flanders. But through Harry's testimony, we know his story. We know he died slowly over 24 hours in a shell crater. We know he was scared. We know he asked Harry to write to his mother. We know Harry held his hand until the end. That matters. Keeping that memory alive matters. Because it's not just history. It's a warning. This is what war does. Not in the abstract, not in statistics. This is the reality. Young men drowning in craters, poison gas, trauma that lasts a lifetime. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. What struck you most about Harry's story? Do you think we've learned from World War I? Or are we doomed to repeat these horrors? These are heavy questions, but they're important questions, and I genuinely want to know what you think. If this video moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with anyone who needs to understand the real cost of war. Not the Hollywood version, the real version, the version Harry Patch carried for 90 years. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into World War history. I'm covering more chemical warfare stories, more individual soldier experiences, more of the human side of these conflicts. And if you want to learn more about Harry Patch, I highly recommend his autobiography, The Last Fighting Tommy. It's a difficult read. It's painful, but it's important. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to Harry's story. And thank you for helping keep these memories alive.